I didn't ruin my life with one bad decision. I ruined it with hundreds of easy ones. 10 seconds into this confession, here is the truth I avoided admitting for most of my adult life: I didn't choose the wrong path. I chose the easier one, every time. At first, it felt smart. Why struggle if you don't have to? Why complicate things when a simpler option is right there? I learned early that life rewards efficiency. Minimal resistance. Predictable outcomes. Smooth progress. So I followed that logic. When something felt difficult, I postponed it. When a choice felt heavy, I looked for a lighter version. When commitment demanded effort, I chose flexibility instead. Each decision made sense on its own. That's why I didn't question the pattern. I avoided confrontations because peace was easier. I stayed silent instead of honest because honesty required fallout. I walked away from things that challenged me because challenge demanded change. I told myself I was being practical. But practicality slowly became avoidance. I remember the first time I noticed the gap. Someone asked me why I never pursued something I clearly cared about. I gave a reasonable answer: timing, circumstances, responsibilities. It sounded convincing. Even to me. But later that night, alone, the answer felt thin. Hollow. Like an explanation designed to protect me from a truth I didn't want to face. The truth was simple. I was afraid of choosing the harder road and failing. Easy choices promised safety. Hard choices demanded risk. And risk meant exposure, to judgment, to loss, to disappointment. So I stayed where it was comfortable. I didn't suffer much. I also didn't grow. Over time, my life became smooth in a way that felt unsettling. Problems resolved themselves before becoming crises. Emotions softened before becoming intense. Everything stayed manageable. I thought I had mastered balance. What I had mastered was retreat. I noticed how often I told myself, this is good enough. Good enough job. Good enough relationship. Good enough version of myself. I learned how to settle without calling it settling. Because settling sounds like failure. This felt like control. I wasn't unhappy. That was the most dangerous part. There was no pain sharp enough to justify change. Nothing collapsed dramatically. My life stayed intact, functional, respectable. But something inside me kept asking a question I learned to ignore. What would have happened if I had chosen the harder way? I silenced that question with logic. With gratitude. With comparison. Other people had it worse. I had no right to complain. So I didn't. I adjusted my expectations downward instead. Years passed that way. Not empty, just shallow. I accumulated experiences without depth, memories without weight. I was present in my life, but never fully invested in it. I realized, slowly, that ease had become my guiding principle. If it felt uncomfortable, I avoided it. If it demanded courage, I delayed it. If it threatened stability, I declined it. And ease, left unchecked, shrinks your world. I began to feel a strange tension, not stress, not anxiety, but something closer to quiet disappointment. A sense that my life was moving forward while I was staying carefully within the boundaries of who I already was. I didn't know yet what I had lost. I only knew that something essential was missing. And that absence was growing. The realization didn't come as a shock. It came as a pattern. Once I noticed it, I couldn't stop seeing how consistently I had chosen what required the least from me. I hadn't just taken the easy road once or twice, I had built my entire life on it. Every major decision carried the same signature: minimize discomfort, preserve stability, avoid irreversible consequences. And for a long time, that strategy worked. Until it didn't. I began to feel a growing sense of lateness. Not the panic of running out of time, but the heavier feeling of having arrived somewhere I never consciously chose. I looked at my life and saw something that functioned well but didn't challenge me, didn't stretch me, didn't demand more than maintenance. I had optimized myself into irrelevance. I noticed how my reactions had changed over the years. Excitement dulled quickly. Disappointment barely registered. Everything passed through a filter of emotional moderation. I wasn't volatile. I wasn't dramatic. I was careful. Careful not to want too much. Careful not to expect too much. Careful not to feel too much. The cost of that carefulness became clear when I started looking at the moments I remembered most vividly. They weren't the easy ones. They were the moments when something had been at stake, when I had risked embarrassment, loss, or failure. Those moments were rare. And they were all in my past. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped creating new ones. I saw how often I told myself I was being realistic. That dreams needed to be adjusted to circumstances. That ambition should be proportional to responsibility. Those ideas sounded mature. But they were also convenient. They allowed me to justify staying where I was without admitting that fear was making the decisions. The fear wasn't of failing. It was of trying and discovering that I wasn't capable of more. Easy choices protected me from that truth. They also protected me from discovering who I could become if I tried. The internal breaking point came quietly, as these things often do. I found myself watching someone else take a risk I had once considered, not recklessly, not dramatically, just deliberately. They chose uncertainty over comfort. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Regret. Not jealousy. Not bitterness. Regret for the life I had narrowed. I realized how many doors I had closed not because they were wrong, but because they were demanding. How often I had chosen relief over growth, convenience over meaning. The easy path had spared me many wounds. It had also spared me transformation. I began to see how my life had been shaped by what I avoided rather than what I pursued. I hadn't chased what mattered to me most, I had chased what asked the least of me. That understanding hurt more than any obvious failure could have. Because it meant I couldn't blame circumstances. I had chosen this. Every time I told myself this is good enough, I had been trading depth for comfort. And those trades, made quietly and repeatedly, had added up to a life that felt strangely underdeveloped. I felt a grief I didn't know how to explain to anyone else. Grief for the risks I never took. For the harder versions of myself I never allowed to exist. For the experiences that required courage I never practiced. I realized something then. The easy life doesn't punish you immediately. It rewards you, until the reward becomes emptiness. I was standing at a point where ease could no longer carry me forward. The choices ahead of me were no longer between easy and hard, they were between growth and stagnation. And stagnation, I understood, was no longer neutral. It was costing me myself. I could feel a decision approaching, not about one specific change, but about how I would choose from this point on. Continue minimizing. Or finally risk something that mattered. I didn't yet know which way I would go. But I knew this much. Choosing easy had already taken more from me than I was willing to lose. The first hard choice I made didn't feel brave. It felt overdue. I didn't wake up one morning filled with courage. I woke up tired of explaining my life to myself in ways that made it smaller. Tired of telling a story where I always chose ease and called it wisdom. Tired of realizing that comfort had become a ceiling, not a foundation. So I chose something that scared me. Not dramatically. Not recklessly. Just honestly. I chose something that demanded effort, uncertainty, and the possibility of regret. Something that didn't promise quick relief. Something that didn't let me stay the same. The fear was immediate. My mind flooded with reasons not to do it. Practical concerns. Sensible warnings. All the familiar voices that had protected me for years returned at once, reminding me how much I could lose. Stability. Predictability. The ability to say, at least I didn't try and fail. For the first time, I didn't listen. Not because the voices were wrong, but because I finally understood what they had already cost me. The hardest part wasn't taking the step. It was staying with the discomfort afterward. Hard choices don't reward you right away. They don't soothe you. They don't validate you immediately. They leave you exposed, unsure, and responsible for the consequences you used to avoid. I felt clumsy. Inexperienced. Behind. I made mistakes I hadn't made in years because I had stopped putting myself in situations where mistakes were possible. That was humbling. It was also alive. I began to feel again in ways I had forgotten. Not just joy, frustration, doubt, excitement, fear. My days stopped blending together. Time slowed because moments demanded attention. I understood something crucial then. The easy life isn't peaceful. It's quiet. And quiet, over time, becomes empty. Hard choices filled my life with noise again, internal noise, emotional friction, uncertainty. But within that noise, I felt present. Invested. Accountable. I didn't suddenly become happier. I became engaged. Some things didn't work out. Some risks didn't pay off. I experienced disappointment more sharply than I had in years. But that disappointment came with a strange sense of dignity. Because it belonged to me. I hadn't avoided it. I hadn't diluted it. I hadn't talked myself out of it. I had earned it. And in earning it, I reclaimed something I hadn't realized I had lost. Agency. I learned that regret doesn't come from choosing the hard path and failing. It comes from choosing the easy path and never finding out. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, someone who always chooses what's simpler, safer, more comfortable, I'm not telling you to suffer for the sake of suffering. I'm telling you to notice what ease is costing you. Notice where convenience has replaced conviction. Where relief has replaced meaning. Where comfort has quietly replaced ambition. I chose what was easy for most of my life. And the regret didn't arrive as a dramatic breakdown. It arrived as a quiet realization that I had lived carefully instead of deeply. Choosing harder didn't fix everything. But it gave my life texture. It gave my failures meaning. It gave my efforts weight. It gave my days distinction. I no longer measure my life by how little it hurts. I measure it by how much of me it requires. Because ease kept me safe. But it was never going to make me whole. And now, even when the road is difficult, uncertain, and demanding, I choose it. Not because it's harder. But because it's finally mine.